Well, turn in your Bible to the Book of Amos, chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. This is the second section in the book known as the Eight Judgments. The first section is the introduction. The second section is a pronouncement of judgment on 8 different nations. 6 of those nations are heathen nations, or what we would probably call Gentile nations. And the reason I say that is because sometimes when we hear the word heathen, what we think of is someone who is just morally horrible, someone who is just a horrible person. But actually, back then, in the way the Bible uses it, simply means that they don't have God's word. They are Gentile nations. So I want you to think of it in that way. Maybe I shouldn't say heathen nations. Maybe I should say just Gentile nations. The other 2 nations are Israel and Judah. Now, in verses 9 and 10, Amos pronounces judgment on the Phoenicians, and more specifically Tyre, which was the capital city of Phoenicia. Now, if you do a little bit of research, you'll find out that actually the cities in the area of Phoenicia were city-states. So they all had their own little ruler. So Tyre had its ruler, Sidon had his ruler. But even though they were their own little city-state, they actually had an alliance. And Tyre was considered to be the capital city of Phoenicia. So follow along with me as I read verses 9 and 10. This is what the Lord says. For 3 sins of Tyre, even for 4, I will not relent, because she sowed whole communities of captives to Edom, disregarding a treaty of brotherhood. I will send fire on the walls of Tyre that will consume her fortresses. Now, as you can see, Tyre was accused of selling an entire community or communities of captives to Edom as slaves. So they were guilty of human trafficking just like the Philistines were. And as we learned last time, slavery is an abomination unto God. Now, does everyone know what the word abomination means? An abomination is anything that causes disgust and hatred. So what I'm telling you is that God hates slavery. And he's disgusted with anyone who's involved with any form of human trafficking. Now, again, we see the phrase, for 3 sins of Tyre and for 4 I will not relent. And I want to remind you that this is a Hebraism. This is a Jewish figure of speech. And what it means is that Tyre was guilty of multiple sins. And these sins had filled the cup of God's wrath up to the brim. But this last sin, this 4th sin, had caused the cup of God's wrath to overflow. And now God's wrath could not be stopped. So for their involvement in human trafficking, God's wrath was coming upon Tyre. Now, the indictment against Tyre was not for conquering other cities and then taking the captives and selling them into slavery. No, they were simply the middleman in the process. They had a slave market where people were brought to be sold to the highest bidder, which in this case was Edom. Edom had a large demand for slaves because they had many mines. And the life expectancy of slaves working in the mines was relatively short, and we have to keep that in mind. Now, if you look at verse 9, you'll notice that they were also guilty of disregarding a treaty of brotherhood. Go ahead and look at verse number 9. This is what the Lord says. For 3 sins of Tyre, even for 4, I will not relent, because she sowed whole communities of captives to Edom, disregarding a treaty of brotherhood. Now, most scholars assume that this is talking about their treaty with Israel. And they go into this relationship that Hiram had, who was the king of Tyre at the time of King David, the relationship he had with King David, and the treaty that Solomon made when David died, the treaty that he made with the Phoenicians. But I want you to understand this could be true, but it's doubtful, because it doesn't mention by name any community in Israel being sold into slavery. And had that happened, in all probability, the name of the community or communities would have been mentioned, but they're not. So it's very doubtful that an entire community in Israel or communities were ever sold into slavery. It could have been, but it's doubtful. A more likely scenario is that Tyre was guilty of selling slaves from nations that they had treaties with. And they justified it by claiming that they weren't the ones who attacked these cities and sold the captives as slaves. They were just the middleman in the process. You see, Tyre at that time was the trading center of the world. Now, I know most of us have not been taught that, but it's true. Tyre was the trading center of the world. Anything and everything that you could possibly want was sold from Tyre. In fact, let's read what Ezekiel had to say about Tyre and its position as the World Trade Center. Look at Ezekiel chapter 27, verse 3, and then we're going to jump down and read verses 12 through 25. Notice what it says. That mighty gateway to the sea. In other words, all of the nations that were landlocked, that didn't have access to the sea, if they wanted to ship their goods, where did they go? They went to the gateway to the sea. They went to Tyre. That mighty gateway to the sea, the trading center of the world. Now, that's not my words. That's Ezekiel's words. The trading center of the world. Give Tyre this message from the sovereign Lord. Again, the word Lord there is all caps, which means that it's translated from the Hebrew word Yahweh. It's the redeeming, covenant-keeping name of God. But this is what the Lord says. You boasted, O Tyre, my beauty is perfect. Now let's jump down to verse number 12 and let's read all the way to verse number 25, because I want you to get a good idea of all of the nations that traded with Tyre, or actually went to Tyre in order to sell their goods and to have them shipped to other countries. And I want you to see everything that they sold, that they shipped across the Mediterranean Sea. So let's start in verse number 12. Tarshish. How many of you remember Tarshish? What is Tarshish? Why is that famous? Why do you remember that name? Jonah. Remember when Jonah was told to go to Nineveh, the prophet? And what did he do? He bought a ticket to Tarshish. Where is Tarshish? Does anyone know? Well, there's two possibilities. It's either in southern Spain or it's actually Great Britain and Ireland, that area up in there. But the majority of scholars believe that it's in southern Spain. Now, you need to understand something about Tarshish. Tarshish was known for its mines. In fact, in the southern part of Spain and also in Great Britain, there's many mines. And what do they mine? Silver, iron, tin, and lead. So Tarshish was actually a mining community. Notice what it says. Tarshish sent merchants to buy your wares in exchange for silver, iron, tin, and lead. So they mined this iron ore out of the ground, but they had to ship it to these other countries. Now, can you imagine the ships that they needed in order to actually ship iron ore to other countries? They had some huge ships. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But anyways, notice what it says. Let's keep going. Merchants from Greece, Tubal, and Meshech. In other words, those countries up around the Black Sea brought slaves. Oh yeah, Tyre had the largest slave market in the world at that time. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And articles of bronze to trade with you. From Beth Togarmah. Where's Beth Togarmah? Beth, of course, means house. Togarmah is referring to Armenia. So around Armenia came riding horses, chariots, horses, and mules, because they were very famous for the horses. They were known as horsemen. And so they had the best trained horses, all in exchange for your goods. Merchants came to you from Dedan. Numerous coastlines were your captive markets. In other words, they didn't have the ability to ship, so what could they do? They just had to ship with the Phoenicians. They brought payment in ivory, Tuscan, ebony woods. Where's that from? Africa. Syria sent merchants to buy your rich variety of goods. They traded turquoise, purple dyes, embroidery, fine linen, and jewelry of coral and rubies. Judah and Israel traded for your wares, offering wheat from Minnith, figs, honey, olive oil, and balm. Damascus sent merchants to buy your rich variety of goods, bringing wine from Helbon and white wool from Zahar. Now, they brought wine from Helbon. What's interesting is the Assyrian kings, they wouldn't drink anything except wine from Helbon. They were famous for their wines, much like maybe Napa Valley is for us or different places in France. But they were famous for their wine. Greeks from Uzal came to trade for your merchandise. Wrought iron, cassia, and fragrant calamus were bartered for your wares. Dedan sent merchants to trade their expensive saddle blankets. You wanted something exotic? Anything that you would ever want came to Tyre. The Arabians and the princes of Kedar sent merchants to trade lambs and rams and male goats in exchange for your goods. The merchants of Sheba and Ramah came with all kinds of spices, jewels, and gold in exchange for your wares. Haran, Cana, Eden, Sheba, Asher, and Kemed came with their merchandise too. They brought choice fabrics to trade, blue cloth, embroidery, and multicolored carpets rolled up and bound with cords. The ships of Tarshish were your ocean caravans. Now, I want you to understand, it wasn't that the ships were made in Tarshish, so they were the ships of Tarshish. Actually, because they needed such large ships to ship this iron ore, they became known as ships of Tarshish. They were a certain type of ship, but who owned these ships? The Phoenicians did. because they shipped everything around the Mediterranean Sea all the way to the southern tip of Africa and all the way to Great Britain. Unbelievable what they did. The ships of Tarshish were your ocean caravans. Your island warehouse was filled to the brim. So everyone who was landlocked actually brought all of their wares to Tyre. They had this ability to be able to store it, and then they would ship it all around the Mediterranean coast and down to South Africa and up to even Great Britain. So as I said, Tyre was the trading center of the world at that time. And anything and everything that you could possibly want was sold from Tyre, including people. The whole city was a warehouse of goods from around the world. And from God's perspective, nothing was wrong with this except the selling of people, human trafficking. Now, during the reign of Jehoram, the Philistines attacked Judah, and they took many of the people captive, many of the citizens of Israel captive. You'll find that in the book of 2 Chronicles, chapter 21, verses 16 and 17. But the reason they took the people captive was so that they could sell them as slaves. And of course, Tyre had the largest slave market in the world at that time. Human traffickers from all over the world came there to buy slaves. In fact, they only opened the slave market one day a week. And ancient historians tell us that they would sell as many as 10,000 slaves a day. 10,000 slaves a day. So, of course, that's where the Philistines took the captives when they attacked Jerusalem and they attacked the cities in Judea. So it's kind of interesting. Everyone who wanted something went to Tyre. Now look at Joel chapter 3, verses 4 through 6. Because God is having all of these sins. We talked about all of these sins that are adding up until finally it just overflows. So we're seeing a little bit of this in Joel chapter 3, verses 4 through 6, and also as we read these stories. Notice what it says. What do you have against me, Tyre and Sidon, you cities of Philistia? Are you trying to take revenge on me? If you are, then watch out. I will strike swiftly and pay you back for everything you have done. You have taken my silver and gold and all my precious treasures, and have carried them off to your pagan temples. You have sold the people of Judah and Jerusalem to the Greeks, so they could take them far from their homeland. The Greeks really were even more cruel than the Romans. If you go back and study what they did to their Greeks, they truly were chattel property. And so the worst thing that could happen to you was to be sold to the Greeks because of the way they perceived slaveries. Now, Tyre wasn't the one who attacked Judah and took their people captive. That was the Philistines. But Tyre was where they sold them as slaves. Tyre was the middleman in the process. But here's what you need to understand. In God's eyes, they were just as guilty, if not more, because they fed the demand for slaves. And people, that's an important lesson for us. You know, many times we think that pornography is not, that's just between you and no one else. But you need to understand something. Pornography feeds the demand for human trafficking. And you are just as guilty as those who sell sex slaves as the people who's actually involved in the process. And the reason why is because you feed the demand for that. So if you're involved in pornography, you need to understand how God views it. To him, you are just as guilty as those who are selling people into sexual slavery. And you need to let that sink in, especially as we study this and go through the book of Amos. Now, Amos could have been referring to this incident when he indicted Tyre for human trafficking, and in the process of selling Jews, he broke this treaty of brotherhood that they had with Israel. But they did this with all the nations, not just with Israel. And you need to understand that. When people were brought to be sold as slaves, they didn't ask any questions. It didn't matter where you were from. It didn't matter what nationality you were or how you got there. If you were brought as a slave to Tyre, then you would be sold in the market. No questions asked. They didn't honor any treaty with any nation when it came to selling people as slaves. And that's what he's talking about when he says you broke the treaty of brotherhood. In other words, they had these treaties with nations, but they were trading treaties. But when it came to selling their people, they didn't care. If you came and someone had captured you, they sold you in their markets. Now, because Tyre was the trading center of the world, they established colonies as outposts throughout the Mediterranean Sea. In fact, most of us don't realize that Carthage, Cyprus, Rhodes, Malta, all of those names that we're familiar with that surround the Mediterranean Sea, all of those were at one time colonies of the Phoenicians. Yeah. Those were started by the Phoenicians, and the reason they were started is to be outposts for their selling ships to come into their harbors to be able to get more supplies as they were continually selling through the Mediterranean Sea and around the world. Now, as a result, Tyre became one of the wealthiest cities in the ancient world, if not the wealthiest. And most people don't realize that. So for their sin of human trafficking and for breaking their treaty of brotherhood, not only with Israel, but with the other nations as well, God was going to punish them. Look at verse number 10. I will send fire on the walls of Tyre that will consume her fortresses. Now, to be honest with you, this is a very general prophecy concerning judgment, with only two specifics that are given. First, Amos prophesied that the walls of the city would be breached and torn down. That's what he means by sending fire upon the walls. Fire was actually a symbol of destruction, so it means that the walls would be breached and they would be torn down. Secondly, its palaces, its government buildings, and its palatial houses would be destroyed. In fact, the word fortresses, and if you notice it's plural, refers to the palace and the palatial homes and the government buildings. But that's as specific as Amos gets in verse number 10. So in essence, there's not much detail that's given by Amos. All in all, it's a pretty general prophecy. But the prophet Ezekiel also prophesied that judgment was coming upon Tyre. And he went into a lot greater detail than Amos. Now, what we need to understand is that when it came to a judgment, many times God used multiple prophets. He didn't just use one prophet. So as we're going through the book of Amos, many times we'll take a break and then we'll go over to another prophet because another prophet was also prophesying the same thing. You know, when it comes to the messianic prophecies or when it comes to any of the prophecies in the Bible, very seldom is there just one place where that prophecy is given. But God uses multiple prophets to do that. So the prophet Ezekiel also prophesied that judgment was coming upon Tyre, and he went into much greater detail than Amos did. In fact, 3 chapters in the book of Ezekiel are devoted to Tyre. 3 chapters. Chapter 26, chapter 27, and chapter 28. That's a lot. And we're just going to focus on chapter 26 tonight. But if we wanted to, we could spend the next 6 months just looking at these 3 chapters. So let's look at what Ezekiel prophesied concerning judgment upon Tyre. So turn to the book of Ezekiel, chapter 26, and let's read verses 1 and 2 so we can understand the judgment that's coming upon Tyre. It starts with this prophecy with Amos, who prophesied sometime around 755 BC. Now, Ezekiel's prophesying sometime around 785 or 585 BC. So there's a large span of time between the two, but Ezekiel is actually giving us more detail from what Amos said. So let's read verses 1 and 2. On February the 3rd, during the 12th year of King Jehoiakim's captivity, this message came to me from the Lord. Son of man, Tyre has rejoiced over the fall of Jerusalem, saying, Ha! She was the gateway to the rich trade routes to the east. It has been broken, and I am the heir. Because she has been made desolate, I will become wealthy. Now, as most of you know, Jerusalem fell in the summer of 586 BC. Most of you knew that, right? Those are very important dates. 722 BC is when Israel, the northern tribes, fell to the Assyrians and were carried into captivity. And then in 586 BC, and the reason God spared Judah is because they did have some good kings. And they did implement reform. And at periods of time, they tried to serve the Lord. And for that, judgment was prolonged. That's a good lesson for us here in America. If we continue to have wicked presidents, then we're going to speed up the judgment process of God. If we have good, godly presidents, then we can prolong the judgment from coming. Of course, I don't see any hope in this election cycle, but that's another story. But here's what I want you to understand. Ezekiel is prophesying this right after the fall of Jerusalem. You see, Ezekiel, who was carried into captivity during the second exile, heard about Jerusalem falling from a person who had escaped when Jerusalem fell. Now, most of you probably don't know that, but there were actually 3 groups that went into captivity at 3 different times, and we refer to them as the 3 exiles. See, when Babylon first came, when Nebuchadnezzar first came, Israel realized, because the prophets were prophesying, that Babylon was the messenger or servant of God bringing judgment, and they needed to submit to him. And so when they first came, they did submit. And what they did is they paid tribute, and they allowed certain of the aristocrats, the more educated, to be carried back to Babylon. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were part of that. They were young men at the time, probably 14 years of age, and they were carried back to the capital, and we read a little bit about that in the book of Daniel. Ezekiel was carried about 5 years later in the second captivity. He also was very educated, but he wasn't taken to the capital. He went more to the agricultural zone. But that's where he began to prophesy. And all of them were prophesying, including Jeremiah, who was about a generation older, even though they were all contemporaries and prophesied at the same time. Daniel was about 14 years old, and Jeremiah is probably mid-40s. Ezekiel is a young man also. Daniel gets carried into captivity while Jeremiah is prophesying that you need to submit to Babylon. Ezekiel, of course, is carried into captivity in the second exile. Jeremiah is still prophesying. So all three of them knew each other. Does that make sense? Now, Ezekiel, who was carried into captivity during the second exile, heard about Jerusalem falling from someone who escaped when Jerusalem fell. Look at Ezekiel chapter 33, verse 21, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. It says, on January the 8th, during the 12th year of our captivity, a survivor from Jerusalem came to me and said, the city has fallen. And about a month later, the Lord spoke to Ezekiel about judgment coming upon Tyre for rejoicing over Jerusalem's fall. And that's when Ezekiel penned chapter 26, chapter 27, and chapter 28 in his book, which is all about Tyre. Now, why was Tyre rejoicing over the fall of Jerusalem? Does anyone know? Well, look back at verse number 2. So, son of man, and of course this was not just a messianic title, but Ezekiel used this, and there's a reason why. When we study the book of Ezekiel, I'll explain it. I'd have to go into too much detail tonight, so we won't. But there was also a title that was given to Ezekiel. I'll give you a little hint. It's because he probably said more in depth about the Messiah and his second coming than anyone. So, anyways, son of man, Tyre has rejoiced over the fall of Jerusalem, saying, ha! Now, you need to understand, in the original Hebrew, this is a sound that someone makes of joyful glee at the calamity of someone else. So it would almost be like neener, neener. Anyone know what I'm talking? Or na, 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 na. In other words, something bad happens to someone. So that's what that word ha means. Ha! She who was the gateway to the rich trade routes to the east has been broken. And I am the heir. Because she has been made desolate, I will become wealthy. You see, Tyre dominated the shipping industry on the Mediterranean Sea, as I've already said. But Jerusalem controlled the caravan routes from the west, or from the east. In fact, the Silk Road from the east to the west had two routes. One took you through Anatolia, also known as Asia Minor, which today is Turkey. Let me show you that on the map. How many of you are familiar with geography? If you're familiar with geography, there's Portugal right there, there's Spain, come up to France, then we come down to Italy, get down to here, and this is Greece. Now, when you get to here, this is Turkey today. That's also known in the ancient time as Anatolia, or Asia Minor. Everyone with me? So, you actually had two routes when you were trying to go from the east to the west on the Silk Road. One took you through Anatolia. Here's a map of it. But it was very difficult traveling because when you look at this map, what you'll notice is the topography is very mountainous. In fact, when Rocky went with me to Turkey and Greece, not this summer, but last summer, I think the thing that shocked him the most was the size of the mountains. You know, we talk about the Ozark Mountains. People, these are hills. When you go to Turkey, you find out what mountains are, and it's a very mountainous region. And so the only way that you can actually get through this mountainous region is through the passes, which sets you up for ambushes by bandits. So it was very difficult traveling through Anatolia because of the mountains and the bandits. So the other route took you through modern-day Syria to Israel, where you could cut through the Jezreel Valley and go all the way to Tyre. Now, this was the quickest and the safest route, but you had to pay a toll fee when you went through Israel if you went to Tyre. Now, if you chose to go down to Jerusalem and then down to the seaport of Joppa, the toll fee was very minimal. And the reason why is because they were good business people. You wanted all of these caravans to actually come to Jerusalem because it meant business. It meant you were receiving all of these wares, you were selling all of these wares. You had a market that was open up to you. Not only that, when they wanted to ship them throughout the Mediterranean Sea, they would go down to the city of Joppa, which was a part of Israel. It later becomes known as Jaffa, with 2 F's, but at that time in the Bible, you'll see it Joppa. It's just a name change, but they would go there and they would use the Israeli ships. So you need to understand that either way, Israel actually had the best spot to be able to control the Silk Road. They also controlled the spice road from India, Arabia, Northeast Africa. So if Jerusalem fell to Babylon, then Tyre would inherit the gateway to the trade routes to the east. So they would become the undisputed gateway from the west to the east and from the east to the west. Kind of like St. Louis. You know, when we think of that, when the pioneers were going west, we talked about St. Louis, or we referred to St. Louis as being the gateway to the west. Why? Because that's where the majority of them went when they crossed the Mississippi River on their way west. Well, see, Israel was the place that the spice road crossed and the Silk Road crossed. So they were the gateway to the east. They were able to come in and to make them pay a toll fee, and they actually had a part of their market, and we need to understand that. Look back at verse number 2, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Son of man, Tyre has rejoiced over the fall of Jerusalem, saying, Ha, she who was the gateway to the rich trade routes to the east has been broken, and I'm the heir. Because she's been made desolate, I will become wealthy. Now, here's what's funny. Tyre was already wealthy, incredibly wealthy. But the truth is, man's desire for money can never be satisfied. People, it doesn't matter how much money you make, you'll always want a little more money. In fact, the more money you make, the more you realize, I could have something else if I made a little bit more. And then when you make a little bit more, you go, and I could do this if I had a little bit more. You see, Tyre was incredibly wealthy, but they still wanted more. So with the fall of Jerusalem, all Tyre could see was dollar signs. So they were rejoicing over Israel's demise. Now look at verse 3. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Why does he say sovereign Lord? Because God decides what will happen. He has the ultimate say. Yes, he's given men a free will, but you need to understand something. God's will be done, and if he decrees something to happen, it will happen. He says, I am your enemy, O Tyre, and I will bring many nations against you, like the waves of the sea crashing against your shoreline. Now I want you to notice that God was going to bring many nations against Tyre, not just one, and they wouldn't come all at once. They would come like waves of the sea crashing on the shore. In other words, one would come, and then years later, another one would come, and then another and another. In fact, I won't talk about the last two because they're really kind of minor, but they did come in like waves. Until finally the city would be completely destroyed, never to rise again as the trade center of the world. Now, in this chapter, Ezekiel prophesies in great detail how all of this is going to happen. Look at verse number 4. He says, they, notice that pronoun they, it's plural. They will destroy the walls of Tyre and tear down its towers. I will scrape away its soil and make it a bare rock. So I want you in your Bible to underline that pronoun they. It's plural, indicating that it will take more than one nation to fulfill this prophecy. You need to keep that in mind as we go through these verses. One nation will tear down the walls and towers. Another nation will haul the debris away, tossing it into the sea, and they would literally scrape the ground until only dust remained, making it look like the top of a rock, as if a city had never, ever been there. So according to Ezekiel, it's going to take more than one nation to accomplish this, to fulfill this prophecy, and we need to keep this in mind. Now look at verse number 5. It will be just a rock in the sea, a place for fishermen to spread their nets, for I have spoken, says the sovereign Lord. Tyre will become the prey of many nations. Now, fishermen like to spread their nets on rocks so that the nets don't get snagged and become torn. They don't put them on bushes. They don't put them in the branches of trees, because then when you try to pull them down, it kind of snags it and it tears them. So what they like to do is they like to lay them on rocks. So what this is saying is that by the time this prophecy is fulfilled, the great city of Tyre will be gone. And what will be left will be a small fishing village. And people are like, what? There's no way. Ezekiel's prophesying this. You need to understand. The Phoenician navy was the strongest navy in the world. They ruled the sea. The boundary of their nation, even though it was a small little island and a little city on a coast, their boundaries was the Mediterranean Sea. Everyone traded with them, and everyone feared them. And he comes along and says, by the time God gets through with them, they're going to be nothing more than a little fishing village. No longer the trade center of the world. And people, it's really interesting how this takes place. But he says, Ezekiel does, that it will never be rebuilt as the mighty trading center it once was. Look at verse 6. And its mainland villages. Do you see that word mainland? This implies it was an island. And its mainland villages will be destroyed by the sword. Then they will know that I am the Lord. Now, what most people don't know, but should, is that almost every ancient city that was a major city had an acropolis. Does everyone know what an acropolis is? Everyone thinks that the Acropolis is in Athens. And you go over to Greece and you go to Athens and you go up on the Acropolis. Yes, it was an acropolis. That's why it's called an acropolis. But every major city in the ancient world had an acropolis. So does everyone know what an acropolis is? Well, if you don't, then write this down. An acropolis is a citadel or a fortress built on a hill within the city. And the reason almost every major city had an acropolis is because the citizens needed a place to go if the city walls were breached. It was kind of like a fortress within a fortress. And normally the king's palace, along with the government buildings and the temple of the city, were located in the acropolis. Now, if you ever go to Greece and you go up on their acropolis, you'll go visit the Parthenon, but you'll find out that there were other buildings up there, but there wasn't a palace, and the reason there wasn't a palace is because they were a democracy. But they had also palatial buildings up there and government buildings. And it had walls around it, and the whole purpose of it was if someone breached the walls of your city, then the citizens could run, and they could be up on top of the hill. Now they've got this huge walls that are around them, and they would be protected. And in fact, what's kind of interesting is when Rocky went with me to Greece and Tyre, Greece and Turkey, and we went to all these cities, I would say, you see that there? And he'd say, yeah, that's their Acropolis. And for the first few times I said that, I noticed he'd get this confused look. And he almost had this look like, well, Pastor, I don't want to correct you, but the Acropolis is at Athens, Greece. I mean, he had that look on his face. And finally I said, did you not realize that every city, every ancient major city had an acropolis? He said, no. And about that time, the guide comes in and starts explaining a little bit about their acropolis and how it worked and everything. And he had no idea that that's how it was. Now, the old city of Tyre was built on the Mediterranean coast of what is now Lebanon. And at that location, there wasn't a hill in which to build an acropolis for the city. But a half-mile offshore was an island with two natural harbors. And on this island, the city of Tyre built their acropolis. So Tyre actually had two cities. One on the mainland, known as the old city of Tyre, and one on the island, known as the new city of Tyre. Here's a map to kind of show you. Here's the Lebanon coast. So the city actually came out here, and the walls of the old thing came out into the ocean. And they went all the way around the old city of Tyre out in the ocean, so it kind of made its own protected little harbor here. But then a half a mile off the shore was this island, and it's about 142 acres. It had two natural harbors. Because Egypt was to the south, this was known as the Egyptian harbor, and because Sidon was to the north, this was known as the Sidonian harbor to the north. Now what's interesting is they went out to this island and they built walls 160 feet tall. That's where they built their acropolis. So they actually had two cities. One on the mainland known as the old city of Tyre, and one on the island known as the new city of Tyre. Now, the king's palace, the government buildings, and the temples of the city were built on the island. And having their acropolis on an island with two harbors gave the people of Tyre a strategic advantage during a time of war. You see, whenever an enemy nation came against you, the first thing that they would do is they would lay siege to your city. They would cut off the supply lines to your city, because what they really wanted to do was to take your city without having to suffer a lot of casualties. So what they would do is they would put up a siege wall around your city, and they would cut off all supplies coming into the city. Now, the majority of cities had some type of water supplies. If you remember when the Assyrians were coming against Jerusalem at the time of Hezekiah, the main body of water, the Gihon spring, was outside the wall. So what did he do? Well, he went in there and he walled that off and he directed the flow of the spring. He actually dug a tunnel. If you go to Israel, you'll walk through Hezekiah's tunnel. And he dug this tunnel out of solid rock and brings it down to the pool of Siloam, and that's where they would get their water. But the reason they did that is because if there was a siege wall, he knew they were going to not only cut off the food supply, but they would also be cut off from water. So the first thing that your enemy did was he built this siege wall around it. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to cut off your food supply. But Tyre, having an island a half-mile offshore, allowed the Phoenicians to store their supplies into that under that island, and then they could actually sell it into the city. So their food supply was never cut off. You couldn't starve them out like other cities. It didn't matter if you cut them off from the food supply coming from land; they just brought it in from the sea. Now look at verses 6 through 11. In its mainland villages, this is the prophecy against Tyre. In its mainland villages, not the island, the mainland villages will be destroyed by the sword. Then they will know that I am the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. From the north I will bring King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon against Tyre. He is the King of kings and brings his horses, chariots, charioteers, and great army. First he will destroy your mainland villages. Then he will attack you by building a siege wall, constructing a rep and raising a roof of shields against you. He will pound your walls with battering rams and demolish your towers with sledgehammers. The hooves of his horses will choke the city with dust, and the noise of the charioteers and chariot wheels will shake your walls as they storm through your broken gates. His horsemen will trample through every street in the city. They will butcher your people, and your strong pillars will topple. Now, I want you to notice that Ezekiel specifically mentioned King Nebuchadnezzar and what he would do. And he used the singular pronoun he to refer to Nebuchadnezzar. And this describes exactly what Nebuchadnezzar did in 585 BC. First, he slew everyone outside of the city. And then he built a siege wall around the old city of Tyre, just as Ezekiel said he would do in verse number 8. Now, during those days, the way that you conquered the city, as I said, was you built this siege wall and you cut off the supplies. And they would literally starve the city until they were too weak to defend the city. And then and only then would they try to scale the walls to get inside. Now, when Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Jerusalem, it took 2 years for the city of Jerusalem to fall. 2 years. Nebuchadnezzar was very patient. He just put this siege wall up. They had water, but they didn't have food. And he waited for 2 years until they were literally dying from starvation. And then at that point, they were able to scale the walls, breach the walls, come in, and destroy them. That's how he was able to do it. But Tyre was much different. You see, their city walls went out into the sea, which formed this natural harbor that I was talking about for the old city on the mainland. And their ships protected the city from the sea, and they brought supplies into the city. Not only that, but the old city of Tyre had a spring that produced 10 million gallons of water a day. In fact, that spring is still there today, and it's still producing millions of gallons of water a day. So even though Nebuchadnezzar could cut off supplies from land, he couldn't cut off the supplies from the sea. So the siege of Tyre by Nebuchadnezzar lasted 13 years. 13 years. Until finally Nebuchadnezzar had enough. And he didn't care about casualties. So he built war machines to breach the walls. But when he finally broke through the walls and entered the city, he found that all of the wealth of the city had been moved out to the island along with most of the population. And the island had walls all around it, 160 feet tall, with the Phoenician navy protecting the 2 harbors on the island. And people, this enraged Nebuchadnezzar because he had just wasted 13 years waiting to get inside the city. And when he finally got into the city, there was no wealth. There was no booty. It had all been moved to this island. And he felt like the Phoenicians were laughing at him. So he destroyed everything on the mainland. The towers, the walls, the homes. He even took the roads and he pried up every stone. And they took sledgehammers and they busted everything till it was nothing but rubble. But Nebuchadnezzar only fulfilled a portion of Ezekiel's prophecy. The part that he was supposed to fulfill. But the city of Tyre continued to prosper on the island. Even it didn't matter that the mainland city was destroyed. Well, we just set it up. We are a shipping nation anyway. Our wealth does not come from that. It doesn't matter what they do on that. We still have our 2 harbors. We're still out in the middle of the sea. We have our great navy, and we're still as wealthy as we've always been. So they continue to be the trade center of the world, the gateway from the west to the east and the east to the west. And the inhabitants of Tyre felt like they were invincible. because they told themselves, even the great Babylonian Empire could not conquer us. Now look at verses 12 through 14. They, it's no longer he, it's they. They will plunder all your riches and merchandise and break down your walls. They will destroy your lovely homes and dump your stones and timbers and even your dust into the sea. I will stop the music of your songs. No more will the sound of harps be heard among your people. I will make your island. We're not talking about the mainland anymore. Mainland. Your island a bare rock, a place for fishermen to spread their nets. You will never be rebuilt and become the World Trade Center again. For I, the Lord, have spoken. Yes, the sovereign Lord has spoken. Now, the first thing you should have noticed is the pronoun he was changed to they. So from verse 12 on, this is talking about another nation coming against Tyre and finishing what Nebuchadnezzar started. And this nation would do something that Nebuchadnezzar was unable to do. It would conquer the island of Tyre. And it would make their island that they thought was invincible a bare rock. And the nation to do that was who? Greece. And the leader of that nation was Alexander the Great. And what he did was exactly what Ezekiel prophesied almost 200 and something years earlier. So let me explain how Alexander the Great conquered the island of Tyre. 240 years after Nebuchadnezzar broke down the walls of Tyre on the mainland and turned the city into a pile of rubble, Alexander the Great set out to conquer Persia. But he feared that with all of his troops in the east, it would leave Greece vulnerable to the attacks by the Phoenician navy. So he thought it was very important to take the city of Tyre before he set out for Persia. So he marched south down the coast of Phoenicia, and he sent an envoy to Tyre demanding that they surrender to him. But the people laughed at Alexander's demand because they felt invincible on their island with such a strong navy. So Alexander confiscated some ships from among the local people there, and he tried to attack the city, but they were thoroughly defeated by the Phoenician navy. And it was then that Alexander came up with this great idea. I'm going to build a causeway out to the island. And he was going to use the rubble that Nebuchadnezzar had left behind when he destroyed the city on the mainland. So what he did was he directed his men to begin gathering up all the stones and all the timber and all of the broken rock and everything else that was there and start dumping them into the sea. And he had them scrape the soil to dump over the stones and timbers in order to level it out and make a smooth surface, just as Ezekiel prophesied. Look at verse number 12 again. They will plunder all your riches and merchandise and break down your walls. But how are they going to do that? They will destroy your lovely homes. But how? Well, they will dump your stones and timbers and even your dust into the sea. And within 7 months, Alexander built a causeway that was 200 yards wide all the way from the mainland to the island. And at first, the Phoenicians just laughed at him. All the people in this island, they were laughing at Alexander. But as they began to see, this causeway just kept coming out, and it kept coming out. And they were using all of this debris, and they were building it out. All of a sudden, they got very nervous. And then Alexander brought in his catapults and his towers to protect his archers. And then the archers drove the defenders off the wall, which allowed his men to scale the walls with ladders. And tradition says it was Alexander the Great who was the first one over the wall. He led the charge because he was so enraged that Tyre had done what they said. Now you need to understand, it's kind of hard to decipher between fact and fiction because there's a lot of stories that have different things. One story says that Alexander really didn't want to destroy Tyre. He just came down, and what he wanted to do was he wanted to offer a sacrifice in the temple on the island, but because their religion said that whoever offered the sacrifice was the king of the island, the king of Tyre couldn't allow him to do that. So they didn't allow him. That's what enraged him. Another story says that he sent his envoy there, and they didn't just laugh at them, but they killed them, and that enraged him. But what I'm giving you are just the facts. The facts are he was enraged, and he built this causeway, and he actually scaled the walls, and they broke into the city. They did exactly what Ezekiel prophesied. They dumped the stones and the timbers from the old city into the sea. They scraped the soil down to the bedrock to dump over the stones and the timbers. In fact, here's what's interesting. Ancient historians tell us that they brought in graders. How many of you live on country roads? You know what a grader is. They brought in graders and they hooked them up to oxen, and they literally scraped. After they took all the debris, they needed something to smooth the surface. So they literally came in and they scraped the soil just like Ezekiel said they would do, all the way down to the bedrock, and nothing was left but the dust. And then they spoiled the richest city in the world at that time. They tore down the walls on the island city, the 160-foot walls. They pushed them into the sea. So everything that was prophesied came to pass. And Tyre has never been rebuilt to its former glory. Instead, it became a small fishing village where fishermen spread their nets. And today, hotels have been built on this causeway. If you go visit it, in fact, I wanted to go to Lebanon before all of this Middle East uprising. I wanted to go visit this site. Because today you see the causeway, because of the way the sea is, it literally built it up, and so now it's just a peninsula that goes out to this island. And you can look into the ocean, you can see all these walls that have tumbled into the Mediterranean Sea. Wow. But anyways, hotels have been built there on this causeway that he built. But it's still a fishing village where fishermen dry their nets. Now look at verse number 14 again. I will make your island a bare rock, a place for fishermen to spread their nets. You will never be rebuilt, for I, the Lord, have spoken. Yes, the sovereign Lord has spoken. Now, here's what's interesting. All of this happened about 400 years after Amos prophesied. Now, I'm talking about Alexander the Great. From the time Amos prophesied in around 755 BC to 332 BC, almost 400 years had passed. But about 250 years after Ezekiel prophesied, this came to pass. Because he prophesied in 580 BC, and of course Alexander the Great did this in 332 BC. So this is almost 250 years after Ezekiel prophesies. But here's what we need to understand. First, what God prophesies will come to pass. It might not come to pass immediately, but sooner or later, everything that God decreed will come to pass. And secondly, we shouldn't misinterpret the goodness of God. In other words, nothing makes God angrier than when his self-restrained long-suffering is misinterpreted as indifference by God, or when he delays punishment to give every opportunity for the guilty to repent, but the guilty use it as an opportunity to commit more sin. Nothing makes God angrier than that. But when that happens, it means that God's judgment will be more severe than what was first intended. And when the fall comes, it will be a mighty fall. Now, let me just kind of relate this today. God has made prophecies that Jesus will return, and those prophecies were made 2,000 years ago. And because they were made 2,000 years ago, and generations have come and generations have gone, people have said that, oh yeah, they've been saying that for years, Jesus is going to return. But 2 Peter chapter 3, verse number 9 says that God is not slack concerning his promises, but he's long-suffering, not willing that any should perish, but they all come to repentance. You see, there's a reason why God waits. But here's the problem. The longer God waits, the longer he prolongs his judgment, the greater the judgment. People, when Jesus comes, the tribulation will begin. And let me tell you, it will be the greatest judgment that God has ever brought upon the earth for a period of 7 years. One of the purposes of the tribulation, you should know the three purposes. One of them is to put an end to wickedness and wicked people, and it will do that. Most of the population of the earth, by the time it's over, will have died. But you need to understand something. The longer God waits to bring his judgment, the more severe that it is. Something else that you need to know. It was this prophecy that Alexander the Great fulfilled that caused Ezekiel to be put in the Bible. Because it was so specific. And it was so detailed that when they saw that book, they said, it's got to be God. All this time, if you remember what prophets did, prophets would take their prophecy and they'd have to go to the temple, or they would take it to the leaders after the temple was destroyed. But until that time, they would bring them to the temple and they would give them there, and they held them there, and the prophecies came to pass, then they were included in the canon. If they didn't come to pass, then they were burned. Well, Ezekiel sat there for 250 years, and when Alexander the Great came and he did all that, they looked at that and they said, Ezekiel's a man of God, but they also looked at these other prophecies and they thought, my gosh, look at these other things he's prophesied. The valley of the dry bones. Israel was spread all over the world, but he said that Israel's going to come alive again. And here's what's interesting. Ezekiel prophesied the exact day, the exact month, and the exact year that Israel would become a nation again. If you've ever heard me teach on that, you know what I'm talking about. He is so precise in it. But Ezekiel tells us things that no other prophet does. In fact, he was probably Him with Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Daniel, they were the greatest prophets, and God revealed more secrets to them than anyone else. But some of the things that Ezekiel said, even though they include in the canon, the Jews would look at it and say, I can't ever see that coming to pass. And yet everything that Ezekiel has prophesied has come to pass. I'm here to tell you Jesus will return. And if you miss the return of Jesus, you don't want to have to withstand the judgment of God. Because the longer the wait, the more severe the judgment.